Okay, have a great day.
You all are sick if you support genocide too.
I don't think we are far away in the years ahead from executives and CEOs from some of these companies potentially facing serious allegations and charges in international courts for assisting genocide. The head of Microsoft, the head of Google, the head of Amazon, other senior executives who are deeply complicit. They're not the ones pulling the trigger, they're not the ones shooting the gun or pressing go to kill someone, that's true, but their tools are essential in Israel's genocide, and I think they should be concerned.
Welcome to the Big Picture Podcast. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today we're joined by author and investigative journalist Anthony Lowenstein. We spoke to Lowenstein early in 2024 about his best-selling book, The Palestine Laboratory, which chronicled how Israel tests high-tech weapons in Gaza before exporting them to the world. I'm going to share a link in the description to that episode. If you haven't heard it, I highly recommend you check it out. Since then, the Palestine Laboratory has been turned into a documentary with Al Jazeera, where Lowenstein traveled to Mexico, Greece, India, and South Africa to investigate how the same technology is changing law enforcement and government surveillance around the world. Part of his work has examined how Silicon Valley and the AI sector have fueled the rise of a new arms race, one where technology giants like Microsoft and Google now compete for lucrative defense contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. These are the same companies that once promised only to use their powers for good. Google famously enshrined the words "don't be evil" into their manifesto. But what was happening behind the scenes was a different story. Despite what tech CEOs were saying about being culturally anti-war, reports suggest that from 2019 to 2022, the Pentagon awarded lucrative multi-year contracts to Silicon Valley's biggest names. In the years that followed, more than $100 billion in venture capital funding would go to new defense startups, as the culture within tech started to shift towards the right. Now, with the rise of data-driven AI companies like Palantir, who openly advocate for big tech to fully embrace military technology and American exceptionalism, not to mention Israel, it seems the days of "don't be evil" are long behind us. So, what does the weapons industry look like in the age of AI? Anthony Lowenstein, welcome back to The Big Picture. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for making time for us today.
Thanks so much for having me again. It's great to be here. I've missed the show, so it's great.
Great. Well, we missed having you on.
Thank you.
I know you spent the last year or so traveling around the world, investigating a lot of the stories that you first documented in your book, The Palestine Laboratory. And over the course of that time, of course, there has been a lot of an increased focus in your work and a lot of reporting around the world as to what exactly is happening, not in the traditional arms industry, but in Silicon Valley, in the tech sector, in AI, in this revolution that we are seeing. What have you noticed happen over the course of the last year or so that you have been traveling?
There's been a moment of clarity. What I mean by that is, for years and years, Silicon Valley sold itself as being liberal, progressive, open-minded, supportive of gay rights, supportive of the Democrats. Now, when I say Silicon Valley, I'm talking about many of the big tech leaders, Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebooks, the Googles, etc. And there's a degree of truth that those guys probably did vote Democrat, and they were quite close to the Democratic leaders. But it was all a mirage. And what I mean by that is that all these years, those companies obviously were building the biggest tools of mass surveillance in history, A, which is hardly a progressive value, B, some of those companies were assisting repressive regimes in cracking down on free speech. They were inciting violence and genocide. Facebook, for example, has been deeply complicit in the genocide in Myanmar a number of years ago. And in the last year or so, as Trump was likely to run for re-election, and of course won in late 2024, a lot of so-called Silicon Valley leaders came out openly and said, what a freeing, liberating moment. We can now speak our minds, meaning somehow that they'd been repressed for years under a woke, repressive regime. I mean, this is their language, not mine, but this is what they said. And more importantly, we can now support a so-called Trump-style agenda, which is more aligned with not particularly America first per se, not particularly isolationist. I would actually call it more neoconservative. Probably best articulated by Alex Karp, who is the leader of Palantir, one of the largest Silicon Valley surveillance companies. He wrote a book a few months ago, did quite well, got a lot of attention. And essentially his message in that book, and I'm going to paraphrase, is Silicon Valley has spent far too much time building apps and nice stuff. When actually what we should be doing is building weapons and surveillance tech to keep us in the West superior, to keep us number one. And part of that is partnering with the Israels and others of this world to maintain military dominance. And Karp himself has openly talked about how proud he is that Palantir has contributed to the killing of so-called terrorists. Palantir is involved in Israel's genocide in Gaza, amongst many other places. So there's been almost, when I say a moment of clarity, a lot of these Silicon Valley leaders, who I would argue have always been pretty repressive and authoritarian, the shackles are off. And you see, therefore, there's finally a growing alliance and investment in Israeli defense tech and Israeli surveillance tech. It's always existed, but it's massively deepened since October 7.
Now, I'm glad that you brought up Alex Karp because I think he's a fascinating figure, and I want to get into him in just a bit. But this situation, this culture that you describe in Silicon Valley, where you had all of these tech visionaries talk for years about how technology was going to be this huge progressive force and changing the world and doing good and solving our biggest and deepest crises as a species. And there's also alongside it been this almost this like bashfulness about the idea of ever working with the US military or the Pentagon. It was seen as kind of like a kitschy or kind of a cringy thing of past era. But from what you've seen from your work and some from other reporting, how accurate is that image of how these tech companies actually have done their business?
Well, the first thing is that image was always nonsense because, of course, as we discovered when Edward Snowden, the former NSA whistleblower, released his documents more than 10 years ago now, we discovered that many big tech companies were deeply complicit with the NSA in the US, mass spying on Americans. So this idea somehow that the Googles and Facebook were these liberals who were just sort of mugged by reality is nonsense. They were always deeply complicit. But your point is a good one, that there has been, I think, a more, I would argue, honesty in the last while about what Silicon Valley is. Now, there's always been a degree of tech utopianism, this idea that, as you say, we're going to come and solve all our problems, world hunger, and we're going to bring world peace. I'm not sure anyone actually believed that, particularly. Maybe they believe their own Kool-Aid, who knows. But what we see very clearly now is, for example, since Trump came into office in the last 5 months or so, you have a situation where he has tasked Palantir to build a mass surveillance tool to monitor all Americans. Now, obviously, Americans are being monitored by the NSA anyway, have been for years, but in a far deeper way. So Palantir has an incredible use of big data. They're hugely ambitious in terms of their vision for getting incredible amounts of detailed information about everybody. Now, we're talking about the US here, but that could mean globally. There is, I think, a growing alliance, for example, with a number of Silicon Valley leaders, so-called leaders, who are going to Israel. Since October 7, Palantir, for example, has had a number of meetings in Israel. But putting Palantir aside, who are openly saying we need to invest in Israeli surveillance tech and defense tech, often framing it as Israel does. Israel frames its war, genocide, against Gaza as a war for civilization. You know, a lot of Israeli leaders are saying, I mean, long before October 7, and I have this in my book, but including since October 7, we're on the front lines of the war on terror. You in the West have to support us because we're fighting the war here, so it doesn't have to be fought there. There meaning London, New York, Sydney, wherever. And a lot of Silicon Valley leaders buy into that. So I see the Silicon Valley shift towards far more openness towards Israel as partly financial. They want to make money. They're Silicon Valley people after all. But it's also ideological. It's an ideological belief in the Zionist project, frankly. Now, I'm not saying everyone in Silicon Valley is on board. There obviously have been protests at a number of Google, Microsoft, Amazon for this collusion with Israel. So I'm not suggesting there's 100% buy-in. There's not. But many of these big tech so-called leaders are all in with Israel. Even some of them who might be more isolationist, a so-called America First agenda under Trump, still see Israel as a notable exception and have not changed their support, even despite the last 20 months of genocide in Gaza. In fact, in some ways, that's made their support even stronger.
And let's talk about that cooperation with Israel specifically, because the biggest tech companies in the world, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, have not been very forthcoming, not very public about their relationship with the Israeli army in particular. But what have they been doing, especially increasingly over the last 2 years?
I have quite a lot of detail on the Palestine laboratory, and then I've done a lot more reporting since October 7 around this. And we know a few things. One, Amazon, Microsoft and Google were deeply complicit with, and Palantir, Israel before October 7. There's been a million times increase. Essentially what happened was, after October 7, Israel made the decision, which many of us feared they would do after the Hamas attack, of going big, going large, essentially destroying as much as they could as quickly as possible. There wasn't really a great desire for pinpoint targeting, going after so-called Hamas targets. It was mass destruction. That was the point. And they didn't have enough cloud space. I mean, literally, they wanted to gather so much data, so much information. The cloud space they had, which often had been provided by these Silicon Valley titans, they needed more of it. And all these companies were very happy to provide this. We have evidence for this. There's documents of this. We don't have all the details of this, but a lot of the AI so-called targeting that killed, particularly in the first months of the war after October 7, tens and tens of thousands of Palestinians, still continues to this day, of course, but the mass killing was far greater then, was assisted by these big tech companies. A lot of it was either Microsoft, for example, is deeply embedded with the IDF, again, has been for years, but increased after October 7. The cloud space is part of it, but there's also various tools that the IDF has been using, provided by these firms, to assist in their, I would call, war of annihilation or genocide, whatever term we want to use for it. So the idea somehow that big tech is allergic to war or ugliness or bloodiness was always nonsense. But since October 7, it's been very clear. So again, I see this as partly financial. And as I was doing my film, The Palestine Laboratory, for Al Jazeera, we spoke to people who openly said they're doing it for two reasons. Yes, for financial gain, they want to make money, but they're doing it also as a model to show to other countries, you see what you can do if you come to us and we allow you to have huge amounts of increased cloud services. You can collect data on massive amounts of citizens, so-called enemies, whoever you might want to get rid of. Allow us to help you. And that's, of course, what the Palestine Laboratory really is. It says to the world, look what we're doing, you can copy it. And we've seen, just last week, Israel released its figures for 2024, the most recent figures we have for the Israeli arms industry. The figures were 14.8 billion US dollars, far higher than the year before. I would expect this year to be even higher again. Sales were massive in Europe, particularly. The Middle East had gone up. So this idea somehow that there's uncomfortableness or squeamishness about Israel's behavior in Gaza is not proven by the facts on the ground, which are that the Israeli defense sector is booming. There's some issues here and there. They're often finding it hard to recruit people. I'm not saying it's a black and white picture, but the bottom line is they're making a killing. And I suspect that the figures for 2025 are going to be even higher again.
And that idea of using not only Gaza but the West Bank as testing grounds for this kind of technology is really at the heart. This is your thesis in the book, the Palestine Laboratory, and it kind of focuses on what Israeli arms technologists are doing and then exporting to the world. But when we're talking about these big tech companies, the US-based ones that are working and collaborating with the Israeli government, are they also benefiting from the ability to test their software, especially when it comes to these new AI and large language model platforms that we've been exposed to over the last year or so?
Definitely. I mean, the short answer is AI had been used in warfare before October 7th. Israel had used it in its war in 2021 against Gaza. The US had used some form of it in its war against ISIS, although a very, very early version of that when they destroyed ISIS, or at least the bulk of ISIS years ago. But since October 7, the AI war has exploded. There's no question about that. And these big tech companies, and I've spoken to people who used to work for these firms, have said that if you hear some of the conversations within these organizations at senior management level, they're not overly worried about reputational damage. Yes, there are some who oppose it. Yes, there are some protesters. Yes, these companies have fired a number of staff who have spoken out, as many viewers of Middle East Eye will see, because you guys often post these videos. There is a meeting of Microsoft or Google or whatever, and some staff member steps up and says, how can you support genocide? How can you have products that support this sort of behaviour? So these resistance is happening in a small way. I mean, I salute that kind of resistance, but it's small scale relatively. And I think these companies absolutely see it as an amazing business opportunity, but as a model that they are hoping in other countries, particularly Western countries, but others, US and elsewhere, the UK, Australia, will see what Israel has been doing and be very keen to try to copy that. The irony, of course, is that, in theory at least, a cloud service provided by the private sector is not necessarily all that safe. Now, I'm not saying it's easily hacked, don't get me wrong, I have no ability to hack these systems, but it's run by a third party. So yes, Israel is contracting these companies, but they are relying and hoping that these companies will be secure. So I've always hoped, I'm still waiting for this call, this email, this message, that there'll be a whistleblower from inside these companies that says, I have the motherlode. I mean, there are lots of staff members, hello anyone listening, lots of staff members from all these companies, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, we're talking about tens and tens of thousands of people, some of whom I'm sure are very uncomfortable with what their company is supporting. And wouldn't it be nice, and what a real shame, if some of those documents got leaked?
I mean, that makes me think about some of the engineers from Microsoft, for example, that have been walking out, as you mentioned, making public protests at their annual general meetings. And, some of them have formed this group, No Azure for Apartheid, in reference to Microsoft's Azure cloud platforms. Have you been in touch with any of these people? Do you think that some of those engineers could have intel that they're willing to share with the public?
I've spoken in the last few years to No Tech for Apartheid, a similar organisation, and these are usually former workers of these companies. I have not spoken, sadly, to current workers of these organisations. The people I've spoken to, I don't know if they had classified information themselves, and obviously they run a huge risk by sharing that. They all have to sign NDAs. It's a very tricky situation. You almost need someone like an Edward Snowden who's frankly willing to risk it all. I mean, he essentially lives in exile semi-permanently, not semi-permanently. I'm hoping it's not forever. He's been in Russia now for over 10 years, and with his wife and kids. And that's an unbelievable sacrifice, frankly, for information that we did not know before. So, yes, I've spoken to former staff members of these companies, but what we still don't know really is the granular detail. There's been some amazing reporting in the last year by myself and others. 972 magazine, the great outlet in Israel, Palestine, has done some very good reporting. Yuval Abraham, who's a fine journalist there I think he's based in Jerusalem, has done some really important work breaking some of these stories. And I'd encourage people to read them if they haven't. And he's really detailed how, and let me just give a brief summary. So many of his stories, almost the best way to summarize them is revenge was the key thought here. You can use all the AI tools you want in the world, sophisticated warfare, killer drones, robot dogs, whatever you want to use. But the ultimate message from the Israeli military was, we want revenge because we feel neutered and embarrassed by what happened on October 7th. That feeling has not gone away from the IDF and the Israeli public, frankly, and many in the Israeli government. Not just Netanyahu. This is across the board. And using the most sophisticated warfare tools allows you to cause mass destruction. I mean, of course, what Israel could have done is what the US did at the end of World War II in Dresden. They firebombed the place. Now, obviously, if you look at Dresden in 1945, where my family is actually from, and Gaza today, they look remarkably similar. I'm not the first person to make those comparisons. And using those AI tools has allowed, I would argue, Israel to get away with it. But I would say the caveat to that is this. There is deep legal culpability, not just with the IDF, of course, but with these companies. Deep culpability. I don't think we are far away in the years ahead from executives and CEOs from some of these companies potentially facing serious allegations and charges in international courts for assisting genocide. There's absolutely no reason, speaking to my legal friends, why that could not happen. The head of Microsoft, the head of Google, the head of Amazon, other senior executives who are deeply complicit. They're not the ones pulling the trigger, they're not the ones shooting the gun or pressing go to kill someone, that's true, but their tools are essential in Israel's genocide, and I think they should be concerned.
And that's one of the things that I find remarkable is when you look at the practices of these companies when it comes to their dealings with the Israeli military versus what their own manifestos outline about what their best business practices are. You look at a company like Google that enshrined "Don't be evil" into their founding document. It's still there in some form. It is something that is repeated internally within internal communications, and yet whenever there are engineers, their own engineers, that try and challenge the way that they are doing business, and many of these engineers, especially the ones from Microsoft that we've spoken to, had no idea that the work that they were doing was implicated in what was happening in Gaza. The software that they were working on, the language models that they were advancing, they were shielded from the applications of these softwares. And I mean, even as an example, you mentioned some of the reporting, excellent reporting that 972 magazine has been doing. One of those stories was about how OpenAI turned down a request from the Israeli government to use ChatGPT to integrate it into their systems. And so the Israeli government ended up signing a deal with Microsoft instead, who has a partnership with OpenAI, allowing it to use ChatGPT, which is now integrated in all of its systems. How do you kind of make a sense of that dichotomy with what these companies are doing or what they're deciding to do for their business practices versus what they are saying even to their own staff about what their own ideals are?
I think years ago these companies maybe sold themselves or tried to convince themselves that they were doing good. Listen to early comments by Mark Zuckerberg, the founders of Google and others, and they will say that we are doing essentially God's work. They don't use those words, but essentially that's what they think. Google for years, I've done this reporting elsewhere, was deeply complicit, for example, with the Chinese regime in terms of mass censorship. This idea that these companies, for example, are lily white was always nonsense. And we mentioned before about the change that's happened since Trump has come back. I think these days the blinkers are off. I don't think there's much shame anymore. Now, I'm not saying that they don't realize that some of their staff aren't very happy with what they're doing. That is undeniably true. But at the leadership level, you don't have the head of Amazon coming out and saying, yay, Israel, that's true. But the reporting is out there. They're not really denying it, by the way. There's been some good reporting. I said 972, The Intercept has done some good reporting. I've done some, others. And the companies really, in the end, I think in many ways are proud of what they're doing now. They see it, as I said, as partly a financial gain, but also as an ideological project. I really think the ideology is key here. It's like something I talked about a lot in the Palestine laboratory, was that what Israel is selling is not just so-called good tech or sophisticated surveillance or great weapons. They're selling the idea of getting away with it, but it's more than that. It's also this idea now, I would say, after the last 20 plus months in Gaza and elsewhere, where what we're seeing, and having someone who's written about this issue for over 20 years, visiting Palestine for over 20 years, this is the darkest moment for Palestine in its history. This is not even a comparison point. Gaza doesn't exist. The far right are in the ascendancy. Israel feels they have carte blanche to do what they want. They have the most sophisticated weapons in the world, and on the face of it, that should give them mass confidence. But actually, the caveat is they are deeply, deeply, deeply insecure. On the face of it, you think, why are you insecure? No one's stopping you. You're occupying parts of Syria, you're occupying southern Lebanon, basically. Gaza doesn't exist. The West Bank is basically annexed. Greater Israel project is very much on the way. What are you worried about? Where's the opposition? It barely exists. There is people power, to be sure. And this is what Israel now fears. That there was a Pew poll result from last week. There was a YouGov poll from a few weeks ago. 2 different polls, similar results. Essentially finding the Pew result was saying that in 20 of 24 countries in the world that they polled, the majority of people polled had a negative view of Israel, which is a massive split and flip from years ago. The YouGov poll, I think, had 4 or 5 European nations, and pretty much everybody, the majority, were now critical and against what Israel was doing. This is the crisis that Israel faces. And you can have the best AI in the world and the best weapons and selling all your hardware to whoever you want. That does not bring Israel the credibility that they want. That's what they crave. That's what they crave, and they're not getting it, which is why they're spending $150 million more this year alone on essentially propaganda, hasbara, so-called public diplomacy. And so I see a real dichotomy here. On the one hand, the arms industry is going very well. Israel's so-called war aims, and we could question that it's completely futile and they haven't won the war at all, but Gaza doesn't exist anymore. That's the reality. And they have carte blanche to do what they want, and yet they do not have the legitimacy that they are desperate to have. They're desperate for it. They've always been desperate for it. And that is something I think that Israel and many of its supporters globally are struggling with. How are we as a state so militarily advanced? It's like the US in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Taliban was overthrown in 3 weeks. Saddam was overthrown in 4. There was never a question that America was going to win that war in the first month. Look what happened 20 years on. The Taliban's back in power, and Iraq is, the US influence there is minimal at best. So America craved legitimacy in both those wars, and of course they never received them from anybody, and nor should they have. Israel's facing exactly the same challenge, and they're not going to find that legitimacy anywhere apart from maybe, public meetings for AIPAC or the ADL.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation this idea of a moment of clarity that you had about the way that these tech companies were in fact doing their business, the way in which they were making decisions, but also with regards to their ideologies. And we also talked about Palantir, who's just become this miracle success story on Wall Street. It was the best performing company, US company of last year. Their CEO, Alex Karp, is somebody that has not shied away from saying exactly how he feels ideologically about the world, about Israel, but also about U.S. power in the world and where he thinks that tech should play a role in that. But it seems like, apart from him, others like him in his position might not be as giddy to kind of say it in those words, but in actions, you're kind of seeing a shift that is moving those tech companies a lot closer to the U.S. government and the Trump administration. His inauguration was like a red carpet for tech CEOs, and then when Trump went to the Gulf to get a lot of investment money for the tech sector, a lot of those CEOs, including OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, was there. Do you think there is an ideological shift with how, at least publicly, we talked about what the general public thinks about Israel, thinks about the war in Gaza, thinks about U.S. foreign policy, but within Silicon Valley itself, within the most influential companies in the world, are these CEOs now starting to look at the world and look at the U.S. government and their role in it differently to the way at least they said that they looked at in the past?
I think there are some who are opportunists. Mark Zuckerberg is a classic example of that. If, for example, for some reason Kamala Harris won the election, he'd be all over her. In other words, I don't think he has many beliefs of his own. He's an opportunist. He wants to make money. He's built the biggest mass surveillance architecture arguably in history, and he'll go where the wind blows. I think people like Elon Musk a bit more hard to predict. On the one hand, you could say, well, it's obvious he's all in with Trump. Well, obviously he was until they had a massive falling out last week, and next week they could be back friends again. Who knows? But I think someone like Musk or Mark Andreessen, who's one of the leading Silicon Valley investors, have written quite extensively about their worldview, their ideology. Alex Karp obviously is one of the most outspoken, to be sure. Now, the leaders of Microsoft, Amazon, and Google are not as vocal publicly about how much they love the war in Gaza or how much they think they should invest. But as you say, the actions speak for themselves. Karp, I think, articulates a view that I'm hearing more and more from Silicon Valley leaders or venture capitalists who are going to Israel. In fact, a lot of Israeli tech firms and big tech are inviting Silicon Valley groups, delegations, to Israel. And where do they go? Obviously Tel Aviv. They go out to party, and they take them, of course, to the locations of October 7. You know, there's kibbutzes along the Israel-Gaza so-called border, to sort of make them feel patriotic, so to speak, about why they should support Israel. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Israeli defense sector or big tech sector is solely supported by American Silicon Valley. They're not. But there is a growing symbiosis ideologically along those lines, and I think Trump in some ways has brought that moment up. It may have happened, I mean, let's be clear, as I talk about in my book and in the film, along the US-Mexico border, you have massive Elbit surveillance towers. They existed long before Trump was in. They started on Obama and they completed under Biden. In fact, just this year, they have been upgraded with certain Google technology to make them even more, inverted commas, efficient to see and hear migrants and Native Americans along the US-Mexico border. It features in my film. And so I think there's, on one hand, a mistake to believe everything suddenly changed on January 20 this year. That is just delusional and wrong. Trump is at one level a continuation of former presidents, but also an aberration. What we, I think, are seeing in relation to immigration, Obama and Biden and others were huge supporters of mass deportations. The difference is now we are in the era of fascist theatrical performances. And I'm not denying there is a profound democratic threat, I would argue, from Trump and people around him. I'm not minimizing that for a second. I think it's real. But the idea somehow that Silicon Valley or Israel suddenly became flavor of the month on January 20 is just nonsense. It's been going for years. October 7, the genocide in Gaza and Trump have all come together at almost like a perfect storm to allow people like Alex Karp and others to articulate a worldview. And I would argue, as I said before, I see Alex Karp as a quasi-neoconservative. I mean, the neoconservatives believe that America has to rule the world through military force alone. I mean, Trump's policies, who essentially abandon America's soft power by getting rid of USAID. We can criticize elements of USAID, some was justified, but some of it actually was also helping people who had HIV. I mean, not all of it was for regime change operations in Eastern Europe. It wasn't all that at all. It's just nonsense. That's what Musk said. So if you abandon so-called soft power, which is what America arguably is doing, what do you have left? You got hard power, you got military force, you got threats. And Trump and his people and the Alex Karps of this world believe that that's enough to rule the world. And I would argue that that's delusional. You can cause a lot of damage. But we are in a multipolar world, and regardless of what Trump and Musk and Karp think, America's era as number one is over.
That is, that reminds me of something that when I spoke to William Hartung, the weapons expert from Quincy Institute, one of the things that he said was that Silicon Valley and some of these tech companies are looking at the weapons industry and with the same kind of fervor that they look at like transportation or food delivery. They're seeing it as an industry to disrupt. They're seeing these kind of traditional arms manufacturers like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin as outdated and ill-equipped for the new technological age of defense, and they see themselves as being in the right position to take over and revolutionize how the defense sector is fought. And I think for a lot of people, it's very easy to kind of think about, okay, Boeing makes fighter jets, Lockheed Martin makes guns. But when you think about these tech companies, when you think about a company like Palantir, it's less clear about what exactly these companies do that allows them to get these billion-dollar contracts with the US government. How can you explain to an average listener what a company like Palantir actually does?
So companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, they're still huge, they're still powerful, they're still making a killing. And in fact, their share price is always going through the roof. I mean, this has been the case, frankly, since 9/11, and it's continued a lot in the last 24, 5 years. But you're right. In the last 10 years, there's been this explosion in the US and Israel, the UK to some extent too, parts of Europe, of smaller players. They haven't got the financial size of a Lockheed Martin, but they are producing highly sophisticated, often battle-tested drones or missiles, missile defense shields, various other technologies, robot dogs and others, which are deployed in places like Ukraine, Gaza and elsewhere. Along the US-Mexico border. There is a growing, I think, openness amongst the Pentagon and elsewhere and Israel to support those so-called startups. And when I say startups, they're not two guys in a garage. They're usually much bigger than that, but they're not Lockheed Martin. They're somewhere in between. And in some ways, that makes it far more difficult to monitor what's going on because you have so many players. Yes, there are some big ones. And Anduril's one of the largest ones. They're an American defense company. They're one of the largest now. They're deployed all across the US and elsewhere. They're huge, and they didn't exist 15 years ago. They're now massive. And there are many others. But there are so many smaller startups. In Israel, I regularly read in the Israeli press, you and I won't have heard of 99% of those companies. And yet many of them are deeply, deeply involved in the genocide in Gaza, Israel's war, so-called war in the West Bank, and beyond. And if you go to a lot of these global arms fairs, the UAE, Athens, there was a big one in Athens last week, a lot of the companies that are exhibiting there, a lot of, I should say, also surveillance companies. Now, when we talked maybe a year and a half ago, everyone's always fascinated by Pegasus, the Israeli surveillance tool, and that's still a player, although smaller than it was. Now you have companies like Paragon, which were deeply complicit, for example, some viewers might remember, in the spying on a lot of Italian journalists in the last 6 months. This is a company co-founded by Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister. There are huge numbers of other Israeli surveillance companies that are not NSO Group, that didn't get the bad press that NSO Group got and Pegasus, and are doing exactly the same thing. They're much smarter. They're under the radar. They're still selling to both democracies and dictatorships. And there is still no global regulation. It doesn't exist for spyware, frankly, even for drones. There is no enforceable regulation. I mean, this is the challenge that we have. So I do see, writing or investigating the defense industry can sometimes seem to some people a bit dry, but then when people have realized since October 7 that what Israel is doing in Gaza, it's not the sole reason they're in there by any means, but a key crutch now for the Israeli state is the defense sector. That's only increasing in the coming years. Economically, Israel's taken a hit. They have an endless war. I mean, they are one of the most unequal societies in the OECD. I think they have the highest rate of child poverty in the OECD. It's massive and growing. You never read about that. Massive poverty in Israel. And yet, Israel knows, and this is why they're increasingly developing their own domestic arms industry. God forbid, in their view, they get cut off from the US or Germany, their two biggest partners. And that's an interesting issue. They want to be able to create their own weapons in the future for their own wars if they don't get support from the US. Now, it's hard to imagine, right, the US cutting Israel off. Very hard to imagine right now. But years to come, America's moving in a certain direction. A Democratic president comes in, or maybe even a more isolationist Republican, unlike Trump, who's not really isolationist at all in my view, then Israel might have a problem on its hands. So wouldn't it be nice in their view if they could build their own drones and weapons and missile defense shields? And that's what they're increasingly investing in since October 7.
And as you have documented in both the documentary and the book, that how this technology then gets exported and is used for policing and surveillance, and increasingly now, as we're seeing under the Trump administration, immigration crackdown. What is this technology that Israel is innovating that is then so appealing to these governments, even in the West?
I think there's two ways it's being done. On the one hand, Israel's very effective at lobbying. This is both from a governmental level but also a private level, that they are regularly meeting with American police forces across the country. They're regularly bringing American police to Israel to show them the newest tech, and vice versa. They are saying, look at what we're doing in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel proper. We are so-called managing crime or managing terrorism. That's been the case since 9/11, but it's actually increased since October 7. That's part of it. The other part of it, I think, is ideological. You have an American right and far right now in power. You have evangelical Christians who are the biggest supporters of Israel in the world, far more than Jews. And they are, not all, but a sizable majority, fundamentalists in terms of their support for Israel. Doesn't matter if there's a genocide. Doesn't matter if Israel kills all the Palestinians. In fact, that would be, for some evangelicals, as good as you could get. So when they see surveillance tech, America's using increasing amounts of Israeli surveillance tech, Celebrite's one famous company, there are others, to go after immigrants, to go after so-called criminals, to go after just surveillance, just mass surveillance. Israeli tech is integral now. It's not the only tech that the Americans use, but it's a key part. When I say the Americans, at the federal level and state level and local level. And I do not think there's any other country that has as much influence on the American so-called policing, counter-terrorism, I use that term very loosely, sector than Israel. Apart from American tech itself, it's Israeli tech. And it's promoted openly as tested in Palestine. Since October 7, but as we know, it started long before then.
And that is true for face recognition systems that you've documented. It seems increasingly true when it comes to large language models that are now being used to identify what people are saying on their phones in Gaza on the ground, and that allows then the Israeli army to find targets for their airstrikes. There used to be this idea, and I don't know if it was ever true, that technology, especially in the age that we live in, the age of the internet and social media, was this great democratizing force. This force that was going to allow everybody the freedom to express themselves, to have a sense of privacy, to, more importantly, challenge the administrations and the authorities that will try and strip that away from them. How did we get here? How did we get to this point where now these companies are priding themselves of creating technology that governments can use to monitor and surveil their own people, and that their own people, ordinary journalists such as yourselves that investigate exactly this kind of thing, you guys don't have access to this technology. How did we get here?
How long do you have? I mean, we got here for two reasons, I think. One, for, I would argue now, a sizable proportion of the entire global population. We have 8 billion people, give or take a few. A sizable proportion of those people are now using social media, mostly Facebook, and bought the argument, which to some people is undeniably true, that you can be connected with your family, your friends, with the news. And I've traveled lots of places around the world. For some people, that's undeniably true. That did not exist before, and I actually welcome that. I think to say all of social media is the devil is nonsense. However, what was ignored willfully by governments, by too many journalists who, still now, big tech journalists spend too much of their time, frankly, filleting big tech. This is what their job is, basically. And these companies have built the most sophisticated arms of mass surveillance in history. Facebook, Google, OpenAI, and others. And we've allowed that to happen. When I say we, I mean populations, either willingly or in ignorance. And now we have a situation of people like Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, who founded WikiLeaks, and many others, have said for years that if you want to live in a truly democratic society, unless you have some kind of guardrails or some kind of whistleblowing or some kind of resistance to this, privacy will not exist. And I would argue we are so close to the moment where we do not have privacy. Most of us, the vast majority of us, at least in the West, are not just addicted to our devices, for better or worse, often for worse, but are still providing insane amounts of information about our lives and our work on these platforms for free. And I think what we're seeing in the last, I see this since October 7 particularly, as someone who, I sort of came of age as a journalist when the Iraq War started in 2003, and there was at that point the biggest global protest since the Vietnam War. It didn't stop the war, but it was massive protests in most countries around the world. Now, since then, the largest global protests since 2003, apart from some massive climate protests, have been over Gaza, London, the US, Australia, elsewhere. People are far more aware. They're far more aware that they're being censored. They're far more aware that their big tech platforms are cutting off their ability to read information. They're very aware, which they were not 5-10 years ago, that Instagram, Facebook, Meta, and others are regularly, routinely, daily censoring, curtailing, cutting out largely pro-Palestine voices. This has been the case long before October 7, but it's got far worse. There is an awareness of that. The question is, what do people do with that information? And to me, the only really viable solution long-term is to build alternatives. These platforms, in my view, although I use them myself, of course I do, they're big and they're hard to avoid, but they are not reformable. I do not believe you can reform them. You could break them up, you could cut them down to size, perhaps, but you will not reform them. The ideology within them is one of so-called growth, mass surveillance, getting as much information as we can. And the OpenAI Sam Altman model is frankly petrifying. How anyone finds that appealing is beyond me. It's not appealing. It's this idea somehow, he goes, oh, people will just spend their days just relaxing with their families. Sorry, who's going to be relaxing with their families? The people who are processing and monitoring horrendous data in Kenya, are they relaxing with their families, Sam? Like, what are you talking about? I mean, and again, we have a situation, and people often don't talk about class much in the West, as they should. This is about class. Those at the top end of town, so to speak, as we say in Australia, the rich, they'll do fine for now. The vast bulk of people are increasingly being fed slop. When I say slop, I'm talking about bollocks information, misinformation, disinformation, pushed out by so-called legitimate news services, by Israel, by others. China, Russia, sure, they're involved too. And without massive pushback, without us who don't want that future to create something different and better, it will not happen. Facebook will not reform. Elon Musk is not going to suddenly become a lovely guy. Nor will Google. Nor will OpenAI. These platforms are what they are. And until we build viable alternatives, I'm not talking about some utopian safe space. I'm talking about places that respect privacy. None of these platforms do. I mean, just finally, as an author, I know that OpenAI has, and various other platforms, have brazenly stolen my books for years. As many, many, many other writers and authors can attest, not just me, I'm one of thousands, if not millions. So how is that a model that we want to follow? How is that a model that we want to emulate? That somehow we as humans create something, a book, a film, an artwork, a desk, whatever you do as a human, and our dream in the future is that those companies should tell us and control us what is a better way to live our lives. I don't think any rational, sane person would look at Zuckerberg or Altman or Musk and see them as the ideal way to live life. No, thank you.
And because the other thing too is that these same people, I mean, particularly when you look at somebody like Sam Altman and OpenAI, they started off vowing that they're going to keep their algorithms open to the public, that they're going to embrace this open source ethos of the internet, that, you know, everybody should be able to have access to this kind of technology. And then what we've seen happen over the course of the last few years, as the competition intensifies, as this fear around China getting there first before the US does, and then this becoming suddenly a national security issue, those companies close up and they become a lot more opaque. And these technological advances, these algorithms that shape, as you said, our entire lives, have become a lot harder to understand and even access. So for somebody like yourself as an investigative journalist who is trying to understand how these systems work, what tools do you have at your disposal? How do you strategize about how do you continue to do the work that you do as this climate, as the way that this industry works starts becoming harder and harder to follow?
Well, I don't want to reveal all the secrets on a public platform, of course, but I mean, look, I say on public platforms like I did before that it'd be nice if some whistleblowers paid me a visit. The door is open. Come visit. Love to have a chat. That might not happen, but if it does, please come. I'll give you a nice cup of tea. Look, I think ultimately there is a growing awareness of good investigative journalists from multiple countries that these major platforms that we all use every day, most of us unavoidably so, are not going to be transparent because we ask. That if we keep begging our politicians to maybe regulate them, that they will. Have been now for close to 20 years a big supporter of the whole concept of what WikiLeaks has done for years, which of course has become quite ubiquitous now. The safe mass release of data, yes, understood, editorialized, processed, explained to people. I'm not saying releasing millions and millions of documents online, which WikiLeaks did not do, but people need to have a forum to understand it. That gives you an insight into the world as a journalist. So the people I deeply admire the most and I want to work with and I have worked with, leakers, whistleblowers, those who speak the truth, dissidents, people who pay a high price. And it's not for me as a journalist to tell people to pay a high price. That is a personal decision for them, because many people, for very good reasons, can't pay that high price. They have a family, they have a partner, they have kids. I get that. But I think without a huge public reckoning about how big tech, partnering particularly now with Israel, is attempting to, I sort of see it as, it's the Israelification of the world. Since October 7, I think there has been one of the biggest public awakenings of the stakes that exist around the growing Israelification of the world. What I mean by that is not just Israeli defense tech and surveillance tech and weapons proliferating globally, which has been the case for, frankly, since the 1950s, but it's increased in the last 20 years. But this idea somehow that many people feel that they can't be honest, that they can't get reliable information anymore. And I know that's an argument made on the left and the right. Obviously, I'm a man proudly of the left. But I very much see the challenge that we have for those who are aware of this is, how do you politicize that awareness? How do you get people who are very aware that we are either being lied to, or that we are watching a live stream genocide and all Western powers are very obviously fine with that? They have no problem with Palestinians being burnt alive. They're fine with it. They're sending more weapons to do more. Please burn more babies in Gaza. That's essentially what we're being told is okay. That's normal. That's a healthy way for a democracy to run, apparently. What do people do with that anger? Where does it go? Does it go into political action? Does it go into media activism? Does it go into community spaces? I don't have an answer to that. It could be all of the above. And I think that is the challenge, to get all these people, not everyone agrees, of course, but enough people in a collective way who see what's going on, who are so daily aggrieved and angry and devastated by what we in the West are supporting. What do they do with that anger beyond going onto Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or Blue Sky and expressing that anger? Most people can't do much more than that. They can go in the streets, to be sure. I'm not minimizing the importance of public protests. It's very important. But how do you translate that to political action? This is the challenge. And this, of course, is what those who were fighting the Vietnam War faced in the late 60s, when ending the Vietnam War seemed impossible. Speak to people in South Africa who were there in the late 80s. Ending apartheid was seen as utterly unlikely. By 1994, it was over. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. Now, the war in Gaza hopefully won't last for many, many more years. God help us if it does. But to translate that anger and that people's awareness and awakening, that is the challenge I think all of us face. I don't have an answer how to do that. I see various people doing that in their bubbles. A political movement here, a political party there, a new media outlet here and there. I'm not dismissing any of that. But that, to me, is not meeting the moment. It doesn't meet the moment.
And so what is meeting the moment then look like to you?
meeting the moment, well, as a human, to be proud of humanity again would be a nice start. And Gaza is not the only issue I'm talking about here. Gaza is front of mind for all of us, but it's not the only issue. We are a species that for obviously very, very, very long time have been addicted to conflict. Not everyone, of course, but too many people. This didn't suddenly appear on October the 8th. I'm well aware of that. But meeting the moment means, to me, a wholesale political reimagining about what is possible in our countries, whether it's the UK, Australia, America, Rwanda, Nigeria, wherever you are, in a belief that you feel like your life matters, that you're not, if you do live in parts of Africa and you are someone that OpenAI has hired or Facebook has hired to monitor horrific content, which is happening all the time, by the way, that you feel like you're not simply a slave to Silicon Valley, that we live in a world that does not accept that as normal. I want to live in a world politically and socially and emotionally where there is a belief in community that matters, that there is not punishment for those who have views we don't like. I want to live in a world, and I'm not trying to be too utopian here, but in a world that is accountable. People pay a price legally for crimes. I'm not talking about stringing people up like I'm a believer in retribution. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about justice for Iraq, for Afghanistan, for Vietnam, for Gaza, for the genocide in Rwanda, for the genocide in Sudan. This is not just about Palestine. We do not live in that society. And until there is accountability, this to me is the moment that we're not meeting. Until there is accountability, people's belief in any kind of viable system just doesn't exist. And that to me is what leads to the growth of the far right. And that's what we're seeing in the US, in your country, the UK, much of Europe, Australia somehow at the moment escaping that. I don't know how long it's going to last. And the far right has black and white answers. And if we learn anything from the 20th century, where fascism was on the march, there were cataclysmic 2 world wars that killed in excess of 100 million people combined, we need to learn the lessons of that history. That if we demonize the minorities and don't listen to those who are the most marginalized, we are going to repeat history again and again and again. That's what I worry about. And I see echoes of that in Israel. I see echoes of that in Germany, where I've just been working on a new project. Those lessons of history are not being learnt. I'm not suggesting that everywhere is about to commit mass genocide or war, putting Israel aside. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that there is so much anger. I have not seen this public anger in my adult life, in multiple countries. And that anger, on one hand, is understandable and justified. It partly explains the rise of Trump, partly explains the rise of Bernie Sanders, for that matter. But without some avenue for that anger or frustration, it leads to the simpletons, the Nigel Farages and Donald Trumps of this world, who say, well, the problem is immigrants. Let's go back to a good old time back in the day before we had migrants. This is where, as countries, we are heading. And I do not see enough pushback in the mainstream media on that at all. In fact, often they support it. They see people like Farage as kind of a fun comedy figure. They saw Trump that way. They still see Trump that way. We're at a code red moment. And much of the political and media elite don't meet that moment.
To bring our conversation home, Anthony, there is an argument that says that technology has always existed within the echo chamber of power. And so many technological advances have been directly financed by the defense sector. You know, so much of your work
Absolutely.
has been documenting what Israel and successive Israeli administrations have done to promote the innovations in technology that now seem to be part of the ways in which a lot of how our lives are governed. The internet itself was invented in the halls of the Pentagon. Was there ever a way for technology to take a different route to the one that we're now seeing?
The issue to me is not particularly the technology per se. Of course, we just spent the last hour talking about the massive problems with big tech, and I'm not minimizing any of that. But the issue is not, for example, the internet as a thing. I'm well aware that its history comes from the US government, the US military. The internet can be a liberating force. I still believe that. I don't want people to leave this conversation thinking that I'm a doomsayer and I think, we're all screwed. I actually don't think that. I think there is a real opportunity here. I think that we are... The question is how technology is harnessed. As I said before, creating alternative spaces is not safe spaces for those who all agree with us. That's not what I'm calling for at all. I'm talking about platforms that are, when I say safe, I mean that don't maybe openly and happily host Nazis, which, by the way, Twitter and Substack seem very happy doing, and others. And I use those platforms. I mean, I'm a hypocrite, I guess. We all are. But I think that there is a need to almost reclaim technology from those who are selling us a lie. We've been sold for 20 plus years now, from the Zuckerbergs, the Altmans, the Google founders, the Elon Musks and others. The technology is bringing us liberation and freedom and more relaxing time and somehow a cleaner, beautiful future. And I think that world is possible, but it won't come with the use of those tools. And I think a lot of people know that, because if you ask most people what brands do they respect, Facebook usually comes near the bottom. They may all use it. It doesn't mean they respect it. What is the alternative to that? What are the alternative tools that we can create? And again, I'm not talking about echo chambers. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about viable tech companies that service us, whose main goal is not to service shareholders in Silicon Valley. That's the challenge that we have, to connect people, to inform people, as someone who's an investigative journalist, I do believe that journalism still matters. I know a lot of people hate all journalists. Well, I understand that. I feel pretty similarly often myself, but there are some of us who are good left, and we need good platforms to appear and get paid for it. It'd be nice as well, right? So, exactly. That's a crazy idea in the internet age, but that'd be nice. And some of those platforms exist, but not nearly enough. And that, to me, is where society needs to step up. When I say we, not you and me, collectively we are far beyond simply saying, well, it's all screwed, what can you do? Big tech, they're awful. Yeah, they are awful. And what are you going to do about it? Now, I'm not saying I have a solution to that, but we need to find viable alternatives, because otherwise we are sleepwalking into a world where Sam Altman will be unofficial US president in 5 years. He doesn't need to be elected. Mark Zuckerberg was never elected to anything. But he is arguably one of the five most powerful people on the planet, as is Elon Musk, as is now Sam Altman. And there'll be new of those people in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. No one elected them. No one wants them. We don't want you. But who are the alternatives? And that's the challenge that we have.
And if you are an engineer working at one of these companies and you're sitting on a trove of documents that you are just burning to release into the wild, into the public, now you know who you can send it to.
And me, and obviously there are other good journalists out there. I'm not saying it has to just be me, but me would be nice. No, I think people need to be... Say that again. When WikiLeaks released all their trove of documents in the last 20 or so years, a lot of people would say, well, we always knew the US was meddling in foreign governments. Yeah, we knew that, but we didn't have the documents to prove it. This is what, for example, the State Department cables of WikiLeaks gave us, which to me in my adult life, that collection, if people haven't looked at it, it's on the WikiLeaks website, look at it now. It's some of the most insightful ways to understand US power you can ever read. This is what important journalism can do, which is why I've always been a big supporter of Assange, and I'm very glad he's now out of a British prison here in Australia. This is what's possible, and we need to provide the platforms and the brave people and support them if they speak out and they release information that needs to be in the public domain. And that's, I think, the kind of world I want to live in. And I think most people if they're honest, would say the same thing.
Anthony
Ditch the
Lowenstein.
fear, embrace a better world.
It's an absolute pleasure, Anthony Lowenstein, always to speak to you. And thank you
Always.
for your insightful work as well as your great conversation. And I look forward to this, the next time that you're on. I mean, you're now a friend of the show.
I love to hear that. Thank you. It's been lovely to see you, and I appreciate you having me on. And let's do this again soon. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to Anthony Lowenstein for being our guest today. His book is The Palestine Laboratory, and you can also watch his 2-part documentary series on Al Jazeera. We would love, as always, to hear what you have to say about this conversation, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Give us a like and a share if this episode resonated with you. And if you want to listen to this episode or all of our episodes in audio format, you can find them wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Muhammad Hassan. Salam.